You're listening to the Quint's podcast.
From being the first speaker at the 76th UN General Assembly to holding meetings with CEOs of US companies and scheduled bilateral discussions, Prime Minister Narendra Modi's 3-day US visit is jam-packed. However, this visit also comes in the backdrop of an array of geopolitical developments, from the fallout of Afghanistan to the recent strategic alignments between the US and Australia and the uncertainties revolving around the pandemic. Pertinent to this visit will be the first in-person leaders meeting of the Quad, an alliance between India, US, Australia and Japan. The group, which has only met sporadically since it was formed in 2007, is officially committed to a shared vision of a quote-unquote Indo-Pacific region that is free, open, resilient and inclusive, by strengthening its relations on supply chain, communications, technology and climate change projects. But its recent revival in 2017 and again in 2021 is seen largely due to the growing assertion of China in the Indo-Pacific region, and that all four countries have their respective motivations to dilute China's military presence in the region. And now, given the geopolitical flux in the region with the fallout in Afghanistan and India's sour relations with China post the Galwan Valley clashes of 2020, what is expected out of the Quad Summit and what role can India play in it? To analyze all of this for today's episode, we spoke to journalist and visiting fellow at the Observer Research Foundation ORF, Akshob Giridharadas, and Manoj Joshi, a distinguished fellow at ORF. You're tuned in to The Big Story, the podcast where we dissect the headline-making news for you, and I'm your host, Himmat. As Prime Minister Narendra Modi lands in the US, his visit carries a lot of security and strategic importance with it, given the geopolitical tensions India has been submerged in for the past year. Now, the highlight of the US visit is a meeting of the leaders of the four Quad countries, US, India, Japan and Australia. And it is safe to say that the group has made very slow progress since its manifestation in 2007, when the four countries last met briefly, but then went on a decade-long hiatus till 2017, when the Donald Trump administration revived it. In March this year, the leaders of the group met for the first time virtually and agreed on a shared vision of rules-based Indo-Pacific region that is free, open, resilient and inclusive. Now, officially, Quad was initiated to deepen strategic alliance between the four member countries and safeguard joint security interests. So, what is expected to be some of the topics on the Quad Summit agenda? Akshob Giridharadas weighs in.
If you think about it, in the last year alone, you first saw a naval exercises, the first in 10 years. Then you've seen foreign minister level meeting. You saw the virtual summit happen around February, March. Here in Washington DC, the three ambassadors, Australia, Japan and India, along with Kurt Campbell, met, and now we have a first in-person summit during the pandemic. So it's clearly a priority. And Biden at the G7 also came up with a Build Back Better World, B3W. And what is the Indo-Pacific and the B3W saying? It's telling China, we see your BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, and to use a poker analogy, we raise you the Indo-Pacific, right? And this Quad has escalated from just, routine military drills and anodyne homilies of, free and open Indo-Pacific to some concrete measures of core working groups, right? So the core working groups that I see are 3 or 4 priorities, right? On one hand, vaccine diplomacy is really taken off on full swing, because don't forget, India is one of the largest pharmaceutical manufacturers. 60% of the world's pharmaceuticals are made in India. India has scientific, technical know-how. And of course, India, before the second wave with its vaccine Maitri program, did a tremendous job of being able to export cheap, affordable, and efficacious vaccines to the global south, whereas other parties in the global north eschewed from it. So it thus earning its soft power credentials and its pharmaceutical credentials. And this way, countries like China as well were a little more derelict. The World Health Organization, of course, their vaccine rollout were delayed. So you had other parties like the World Bank stepping in. Now, and of course, 2 of the 4 Quad members, US and India, unfortunately, are suffering for the most number of COVID cases by virtue of the size and the populations. So it behooves on them, of course, the United States with its largest some of the large pharmaceutical manufacturing, but perhaps it's Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson and Moderna, along with India's ability to also export cheap vaccines with the Serum Institute of India, with Australia and Japan's logistic capabilities. The Quad working group can really be something robust. The second part, of course, I see is the climate change working group, because India, of course, like the US and the others, are signatories to the Paris Climate Accord of 2015. The Trump administration had pulled out of it, but that's come back as a priority for the Biden administration, clearly, with the appointment of John Kerry, the former Secretary of State, as the climate envoy or climate czar. And John Kerry was in India recently, as you know, and met Minister Yadekar, Minister Jaishankar, and of course PM Modi. And both India and the United States are doing a lot of work on green energy and looking to cut down on emissions and building up sustainability. So there's also the priority that all four parties are really looking at climate change as a priority. And last but not least, what's really important is resilient supply chains, right? Because don't forget, what the pandemic has shown is the pandemic has disrupted supply chains in ways that will take ways to rebuild. And furthermore, with COVID, what you really saw is you need to have what I call supply chain insurance. Everyone had put stuff already in, everyone had just prioritized everything in the China basket. So when that happened, and when things were disrupted in China, what do you think happened? It just put everything back by a lot. So many countries now are requiring to realign their supply chains. Even Japan, for example, right? What did then Prime Minister Abe say that they were giving incentive to Japanese companies, $2 billion worth across many Japanese companies, not produce in Japan, but just to get out of China. And we're talking about leading Japanese automakers and technological companies as well, just to electronics companies, just to kind of go and manufacture in other places, create robust supply chains. And of course, this ties into the notion of trade. Like the Indo-Pacific is one of the hotbed of trade regions. The ASEAN economy by 2030 is going to be the third or fourth largest economy. The estimates are in order. So building a robust trade along those this is what I see the priority for the Quad Summit, to now galvanize on some of these working groups and now set the agenda forward. And plus realign the vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific with all Tokyo, Canberra, Delhi, and Washington share.
So far, the brunt of India's contribution to the Quad has only been in terms of pandemic response, with the group agreeing when it met virtually in March on a joint vaccine initiative, with India being the factory for producing vaccines for the region. But the production of these vaccines had to be put on hold, since India had to halt all vaccine exports to inoculate its own vulnerable population in the midst of the deadly second wave. According to Manoj Joshi, India's role at the time being may be restricted to being the pharmacy for the group, and its economy will have to step up to participate in any other capacity.
We were not asked to make any specific contribution, but yes, in the March meeting, India was seen as the possible hub of providing vaccines in the region. And India was not able to meet that challenge because it had overestimated its capability. And India itself had very great difficulty and even now it's having difficulty in providing vaccines for all its people. So we were not able to meet up to the responsibility that the Quad thought that we would be able to assume, because we kept on saying that we are the world's biggest manufacturer of vaccines. But when the Quad countries asked us to step up, we were not able to do so. So I'm not so sure beyond that what is there.
However, Akshobh Giridhar Das says given the investment capacity that India has to offer to the rest of the member countries in terms of both economic and defense, India has a lot to offer as the world comes out of the pandemic.
So India's contribution to the Quad is a lot of ways. India's contribution to the Quad has been strengthening. It's not just a bilateral partnership with these countries, but increasing in a more multilateral form of way. India, as not being a treaty ally, has always long preferred just bilateral agreements. We've seen India's hesitancy in the past on multilateral trade pacts. We've seen India was part of RCEP, but pulled out of it at the last minute because it did not benefit India's strategic interests. The Quad grouping can see more enhanced trade, which benefits India's economy. And India, of course, has a lot to offer the world as well, in terms of its as a very, very attractive market for American investments, for Japanese investments, for Australian investments. Don't forget, the Quad can, in some ways, even look like a NAFTA in time on. Like you had the North American Free Trade Association, but in US, Mexico, and Canada, you would say, okay, that's not a Quad because we won't set up militarily, of course. But what the Quad has done is also, so what NAFTA did at that time was create more economic engagement between the three North American parties. And one would say that, look, there was asymmetry of economic power between the US and Mexico. But a lot of Mexican nationals benefit from what's called a transnational visa and the ability to work in the United States. If there was such a sort of grouping that if the Quad can come up with some sort of economic incentive the way ASEAN has done, with ASEAN, the ASEAN passport and free and open borders with ASEAN countries. If at all India could get to that such stage, it looked very idealistic. But if the Quad can get to that stage, who's to say that India can't benefit obviously from three very robust economies in Australia, Japan, and the United States, and similarly their companies getting easier access to Indian markets. One of the things that we spoke about right now, while India and the US don't have a free trade agreement and are trying for mini trade deals, is Minister Goyal has spoken with USTR, Catherine Tai, about increasing market access for India, for Indian goods and services. So that's all very important to India's context right now of trade with India based on market access as well. So within the Quad grouping, if trade can, trade is obviously a very sensitive issue for many countries. And don't forget, trade is one aspect where no matter how good friends you are, you can buy submarines from each other but still argue over soybeans. The US and Canada have taken two of the closest allies and two countries that share a very strong bonhomie, have taken each other to WTO many times over disagreements over lumber. And because trade is something where countries obviously look very poorly at the inward interests, have to be very protectionist on the economy, but still very essential to normalizing relations. So if we can iron out some of the mini trade deals within Quad, that's a success itself.
But there's another crucial point to note: China. Interestingly, while none of the member countries have openly identified China as the reason for its participation in the group, all of them have their own respective motivations to curb its growth, especially India, where relations with China reached a tipping point in 2020 with the violent clashes in Galwan Valley. But actions by the US in the past few years, from tariffs being slapped on China for its hardline economic policies to labeling it as a quote-unquote adversary in its own security reports, the US has tried to show its allies that it is committed to engaging with them in the Indo-Pacific region. But even as all four countries deepen their partnerships towards a quote-unquote free and open Indo-Pacific, will it be enough to curb China's rising assertiveness throughout the region? Akshraf agrees that some of the group's actions do suggest an anti-China in nature, but given the strategic nature of Quad, it gives every country an opportunity to grow economically and strategically, taking them away from the China threat.
The way a former Indian diplomat explained this to me very nicely was India in the Quad prevents it from looking anti-China the way India in the BRICS prevents it from looking like anti-United States. Of course, BRICS having China and Russia, some of the antagonistic force, and the Quad obviously being largely led by the United States. And I thought that's a very profound way of looking at it, because that also shows where India sort of has not a sense of pusillanimity that we've seen in the past, but a sense of foreign policy that's driven by its own interest, driven by a sense of non-treaty ally, strategic autonomy, strategic partners, will respect rule-based international order. Because don't forget, even India in its weakest form post-independence chose a path of non-alignment instead of coddling with one or two great powers. People always forget that. People always think about India closer to the Soviet Union until the 1990s. No, India under Nehru chose non-alignment. Because India firmly believed at that point that it didn't want to trade one set of Western faces, that was the British East India Company after 190 years of colonial rule, for another set of Western faces, that was American consumer companies coming in, and the Overton window was very much towards socialism at that point. But but just to come back here, I don't think the Quad particularly says it as anti-China. Of course, China sees it anti-China. And I think if you read between the lines, to an extent, one could also say, look, is this a great way of playing a game of talking about everything in the world but China? There is obviously, if you read between the lines, you can pick that up. There's no doubt. But I think it's China's actions have metamorphosized and given the Quad structure and given it impetus. However, I think because the Quad has also chosen a constructive path forward, as he's spoken about on these three fronts. And I think going forward, given that you're going to see more Quad level summits, I myself know of Indian diplomats in other parts of the world where they meet their counterparts in Australia and Japan and the United States and have Quad level mini meetings. And it'll be a constructive engagement. It'll be technological sharing. It'll be, economic investments right now. As we know, India, of course, needs to grow at, great 12 million jobs a year. India's close to $3 trillion economy, needs to hit 5 trillion. India can benefit of Japanese technological investments. India, of course, is a big importer in Australia, and is energy dependent. And Australia is, of course, one of the largest commodity providers in the world. There's also the notion of, India also getting more from Australia as well. And so there might be different sort of a pact of sharing. And don't forget, the Quad is not just about military drills. They have military exercises, but that's always India and the United States have done Malabar exercise in the past, even or a Quad aside. Of course, there is also the China element. If you think about what do all four have in common, apart from being four democracies, four vibrant democracies, I might add, all four of them have been at Beijing's crosshairs. If you look at it, the fact that Beijing and Tokyo had issues with Senkaku Islands and the Diaoyu Islands in the East China Sea, and of course other historical issues. Canberra and Beijing ties have really hit nadir after PM Scott Morrison called for an independent investigation into the source of the virus from Wuhan. Even though New Delhi and Beijing had the Doklam standoff, that was reset with the meetings in Wuhan and Mamallapuram. But of course, we know about the Galwan Ladakh clashes, which of course exacerbated tensions to a level that we haven't seen before, because there had been no deaths on the border before between the PLA and the Indian troops. But now it's got to a point where there's still a tense standoff, and even though India and China continue to trade, relations with China have not been as bad as what relations with Pakistan have been. However, there is still that lack of understanding China's perspective, because what I want to say fundamentally is there's a fundamental shift over the way China is. The Deng Xiaoping China had a credo of hide your strength and bide your time. Whereas Xi Jinping China is like, we're done hiding. It's iron hand, no velvet glove. It's a sense of pugnaciousness. And that has gotten a lot of parties riled up. And ergo, there is a method in the madness of the Quad coming together the way it's come together. However, I don't think the Quad's notion is let's work towards a dissolution of any one party or curb them in any ways. Whereas NATO, apart from being protecting against the Iron Curtain, as Winston Churchill would call it, but in a lot of ways, the dissolution of the Soviet Union was a sense of euphoria of how the Western powers won, how the capitalism bloc survived. It required a zero-sum game. I don't think the Quad is based on a zero-sum game. The Quad is based on a free and open Indo-Pacific.
Now, there are also signs that Quad may try to contain the Chinese threat militarily as well. Just days before the Quad summit, the world was greeted with the unexpected announcement of the Australia-US-UK Defence Agreement, also known as AUKUS, where the US and UK will now share nuclear-powered submarine technology with Australia. And the agreement does not stop at submarines, but also covers cybersecurity, AI, and sea and air launched missiles. In short, it significantly increases Australia's military capacity in the Pacific for the next few decades. Now, Quad members have been very careful in stating that the alliance between the four countries is of quote-unquote like-minded partners dedicated to advancing a common vision and to ensure peace and prosperity. But in the context of Quad, does the new military alliance between US and Australia overshadow Quad and dilute the impact the summit would have had? Akshop Giridharadas weighs in.
I'm glad you asked that, because AUKUS took the world by storm and came out in last week in September between 15th to 17th, and the fact that the Quad summit's now happening on the 24th. So it's definitely, in some ways, some would think of it as a sword of Damocles hanging over the Quad. But no, I actually argue it's very different. In some ways, it's given the Quad more impetus, because what it's done is clearly demarcated the roles. The Quad almost was saying, we're not a military alliance, we're not an Asian NATO, we're not meant to counter any one party. And AUKUS is very firmly a military trilateral pact between three Anglophone countries, three of whom are members of the Five Eyes. The other two, of course, Canada and New Zealand, are very similar in their DNA of not engaging in the same way. So what AUKUS does two things, right? One is it brings Britain closer into the Indo-Pacific. And the second thing, what AUKUS does is it allows the sale of high-powered nuclear submarine technology to the Australian Navy, largely from the US. And of course, we know that this meant there was a fallout from France, which of course is another issue altogether. But what does this do right now? Well, AUKUS is very firmly a military alliance. And some would argue that you needed AUKUS in a way that the Quad didn't, because the Quad was still focused on a very constructive economic engagement. I think this kind of bifurcates and relieves the Quad of not having to scream that they are not an Asian NATO. They can continue. Military exercise and military drills are by far routine. They're normal. There's a lot of war gaming that goes on. There's the International Military Defense Expo. There's many such things. It only gets a little more pugnacious when you stray into international waters when things are provocative. So I think in that sense, I don't think AUKUS is meant to overshadow the Quad. You've seen that Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin spoke to Defense Minister Rajnath Singh and spoke about India's commitment for Afghanistan, and spoke about how AUKUS and the Quad are not two sides of the same coin. But different. India says, look, they have nothing to do with AUKUS. And furthermore, it really helps India because India's foreign policy sacrosanctity is based on strategic autonomy, right? So this means securing an Indo-Pacific from strategic partners. Australia, UK, the US are strategic partners, There's also the fact that from India's own perspective, after what happened in Ladakh and Galwan Valley, and China's, don't forget, long before that, China had a string of pearls theory around the Indian Ocean. We're building client states, Hambantota, the port in Sri Lanka. We know about CPEC in Pakistan that runs through Gwadar port. We know about client states in Myanmar and Bangladesh and somewhat the Maldives. So it's been an encirclement trap some ways for India. And the Indian Ocean now has become such a priority naval water body. Because if you think about, what even leading thinkers in the space have said, back in the day, decisions on sea affected matters on land. Today, matters on land affect matters on sea. And the Indian Ocean now is one of the most prime water bodies, almost on par with the Pacific, in securing those waters. And I think having a AUKUS go about, securing and helping secure a free and open Indo-Pacific, it behooves India's interests without India having to get involved. So I think it's a win-win situation for India in some ways.
On the first day of his visit, Prime Minister Narendra Modi has reportedly 8 events scheduled, ranging from meetings with CEOs of Adobe, Qualcomm, and even a meeting with US Vice President Kamala Harris. On 25th September, he is also scheduled as the first speaker at the UN General Assembly. So tune into the Quint's website and social media channels to follow the story. If you liked listening to this episode, please subscribe to The Big Story for episodic updates. We're available on Apple, Google Podcasts, Spotify, JioSaavn, and most of the other popular podcast streaming platforms. For other podcasts, please log on to the Quint website, and for any feedback, please shoot an email to podcast@thequint.com.
Thanks for listening. Log on to the Quint's website and check out our other podcasts.